At our annual family Christmas dinner, my father handed out 40 lavish gifts to my nieces and nephews while the entire country club watched. When my 6-year-old daughter finally reached out her small hands, he looked her dead in the eye and said, "Only good kids get presents. Your bastard child can get out." He expected me to shatter. He expected the old me to beg for his scrap of approval. Instead, I calmly packed our things, walked out to my custom Maybach, and made a single phone call that would completely dismantle his pristine, fake empire. Before I reveal exactly how I brought his world crashing down, tell me where you are listening from in the comments, and be sure to like and subscribe if you know what it means to finally stop seeking validation from toxic family members. The Oak Ridge Country Club has always been the glittering epicenter of Atlanta's Black elite. It is a place of mahogany walls, crystal chandeliers, and generational wealth where respectability politics rule above all else. For as long as I can remember, my father, Calvin Washington, treated this club like his personal kingdom. He loved the valets who knew his name, the waiters who brought his scotch exactly the way he liked it, and the other businessmen who patted his back and praised his logistics company. To him, image was everything. Reality was secondary. Our private dining table was situated right in the center of the main hall, a prime location designed to ensure everyone saw the perfect Washington family celebrating the holidays. The air smelled of expensive prime rib roasted pine needles and the cloying scent of my mother Yvonne's signature floral perfume. My sister Aaliyah sat across from me draped in designer silk and adjusting her pearl necklace every time someone walked by. Next to her was my older brother Jamal and his wife Emily, a white woman who always tried a little too hard to perform her designated role in our family dynamic. And then there was me. At 35, I was still viewed as the family stain. My crime in their eyes was twofold. First, I had never bent to my father's rigid demands about what a woman's career should look like. Second, I was a single mother. When I had my daughter Zuri 6 years ago, my parents treated my pregnancy like a terminal illness that had infected their social standing. They spent my entire 20s shaming me, making me feel like an unlovable burden. But they knew absolutely nothing about the woman sitting at their table tonight. They thought I was still struggling to get my small consulting business off the ground. They had no idea I now ran a multi-billion-dollar private equity firm. The evening had been a masterclass in passive aggression. Aaliyah spent the first hour loudly bragging about her husband Connor, a corporate lawyer who viewed himself as the family savior. Jamal boasted about his newly purchased waterfront property, intentionally directing his comments at me to highlight my supposed lack of assets. I simply smiled, ate my dinner, and helped Zuri cut her chicken. I had spent years in therapy learning how to detach from their bait. I did not need to prove myself to them anymore. But the true spectacle began when dessert was cleared away. My father stood up, commanding the attention of not just our table, but the neighboring tables as well. He signaled to the club staff, who wheeled out a massive cart piled high with beautifully wrapped boxes. They were tied with thick gold ribbons, completely extravagant and entirely unnecessary. Calvin began handing them out with theatrical flair. He handed keys to a new luxury SUV to Jamal. He handed Aaliyah a small velvet box that clearly contained a diamond tennis bracelet. Then he moved on to the grandchildren. Jamal's 3 boys ripped into the latest gaming consoles and designer sneakers. Aaliyah's twin girls shrieked as they unwrapped custom jewelry and expensive tech gadgets. The joy at the table was loud and performative. Through it all, my sweet Zuri sat quietly beside me. She was wearing her favorite red velvet holiday dress, her hair perfectly braided with gold beads clinking softly whenever she moved. She was so patient watching her cousins tear through wrapping paper, her eyes wide with innocent anticipation. When the cart was nearly empty, Zuri finally slipped off her chair. She walked over to her grandfather, looking up at him with total trust, and held out her small hands. The silence that fell over our table was sudden and suffocating. The laughter from Jamal and Aaliyah died down. Calvin looked down at Zuri. His expression did not soften. Instead, his face contorted into a mask of pure disgust. He did not lower his voice. In fact, he spoke loud enough for the prominent families dining at the tables around us to hear every single word clearly. Only good kids get presents, Calvin said, his voice dripping with venom. Your bastard child can get out. The words hung in the air, sharp and cruel. Zuri froze. Her small hands dropped to her sides and her bottom lip began to tremble. A second later, she burst into heavy, heartbreaking sobs. She ran back to me, burying her face in my shoulder. I looked around the table, waiting for anyone to correct him, to say that he had gone too far. My mother, Yvonne, simply picked up her wineglass and took a long sip, looking away toward the window. To her, avoiding a public scene was far more important than protecting her weeping granddaughter. Aaliyah let out a quiet smirk, pretending to examine her manicure. Emily let out a loud, exaggerated sigh and offered me a look of fake theatrical pity before whispering to Jamal about how uncomfortable this was for her children. 10 years ago, this moment would have destroyed me. In my 20s, I would have cried. I would have begged them to love us, pleaded for them to see Zuri as a blessing rather than a curse. I would have apologized for somehow ruining their perfect holiday dinner. I would have internalized their shame and carried it with me for months. But I was not that broken girl anymore. I did not scream. I did not throw my drink. I did not give them the satisfaction of a public breakdown. I wrapped my arms around Zuri, kissed the top of her head, and gently picked up her little wool coat from the back of the chair. I stood up, smoothing the front of my tailored suit, and looked directly into my father's eyes. I saw the smug satisfaction there, the absolute certainty that he had put me in my place. He had no idea that his place belonged to me. Okay, I said, my voice eerily calm and perfectly steady. Goodbye. I did not look back. I held Zuri's hand and walked away from the table. I could feel the stares of the other country club members burning into my back, the whispers starting to ripple through the dining room. But I kept my head held high, projecting a quiet, unbreakable authority. We walked through the grand mahogany doors of the club, leaving the stifling heat of their manufactured perfection for the crisp, cold December air outside. The valet rushed forward immediately when he saw me. Within seconds, my custom black Maybach pulled up to the curb. I settled Zuri into the plush leather seat in the back, wrapping a warm cashmere blanket around her shoulders and assuring her that she was the best little girl in the entire world and that we were going to have our own wonderful Christmas. I closed her door and walked around to the other side. Just as I reached for the door handle, my phone vibrated in my pocket. It was a call from Tasha, my executive assistant. I answered on the first ring. Ms. Washington. Tasha said, her voice crisp and professional. I am looking at the Oak Ridge accounts. Can you confirm the cancellation? I paused, looking back at the glowing windows of the country club. My father thought he owned this place. He thought his status here made him untouchable. He had no idea that my private equity firm had quietly purchased Oak Ridge Country Club 3 months ago, when it was on the verge of total bankruptcy. I owned the very ground he was sitting on. I owned the wine he was drinking. I owned the chair he occupied. I looked through the tinted glass of my car, my mind perfectly clear. Cancel it all, I told Tasha. I want the annual gala funding pulled immediately. I want Calvin and Yvonne Washington's platinum memberships completely revoked effective right now. And Tasha shut down the corporate line of credit for his logistics company. Leave them with absolutely nothing. Let it all burn. I ended the call and slid into the quiet sanctuary of my car. As the driver pulled away from the curb, steering us toward the glittering skyline of downtown Atlanta, I felt a profound sense of peace. The era of playing the discarded daughter was officially over. My father had wanted to make a public statement about power and consequences. He was about to learn that those concepts applied to him too, and the bill for his cruelty was finally coming due. The drive back to the city was quiet, filled only with the soft hum of the tires against the pavement and the steady rhythmic breathing of my daughter in the back seat. By the time we reached the private garage of our downtown penthouse, Zuri had fallen fast asleep, the trauma of the evening already melting away in the safety of my presence. I carried her inside, breathing in the scent of her lavender shampoo, and gently tucked her under the thick weighted blankets of her bed. I turned on her favorite star projector, watching the constellations map themselves across the ceiling, and stood in the doorway just watching her for a long moment. No one was ever going to make her feel small again. I would buy the entire world and burn it down before I let that happen. I walked into the kitchen, poured myself a glass of sparkling water, and set my phone on the sprawling quartz island. It vibrated instantly. It had been vibrating the entire drive home, a relentless stream of notifications that I had purposefully ignored. I tapped the screen and saw 5 missed calls from my father, followed by a voicemail left just 3 minutes ago. I tapped play and put it on speaker. Calvin Washington's voice filled my kitchen, but the composed, arrogant patriarch from the country club was gone. In his place was a frantic, hyperventilating man whose meticulously crafted public image had just been shattered. "I should pick up the phone right now," he shouted, the background noise indicating he was still in the lobby of Oak Ridge. "My platinum card just declined." Declined. Do you have any idea how humiliating it is to have the club manager walk up to my table in front of the board of directors and tell me my account is frozen? The tab is $5,000. I know you did this. I know you somehow called your bank and reported fraud on the family card or whatever little trick you played because your feelings got hurt. He took a ragged breath, his voice dropping into that familiar commanding register he used to use to terrify me into submission. "You are embarrassing me in front of our entire community. I demand you wire the funds to my account this instant. I do not care if your little consulting gig just had a lucky month, and you think you have some power now. You fix this immediately, or you are dead to this family." The voicemail ended with a sharp click. 10 years ago, a message like that would have sent me into a full panic attack. I would have scrambled to my bank app, drained my savings, and begged for his forgiveness just to keep the peace. I would have sacrificed my own stability to protect his precious reputation. But tonight, listening to his demands echo off the walls of my kitchen, I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, satisfying clarity. He thought I was still that desperate girl. He thought I was still running a small consulting firm out of a rented office. He had never bothered to ask about my life, never bothered to look up my company, and so he was entirely blind to the financial titan I had become. I did not call him back. I did not argue. I did not justify my actions. I simply opened the encrypted files on my tablet and pulled up the legal documentation for Vanguard Acquisitions. I found the specific portfolio for the Oak Ridge Country Club. It detailed the multi-million-dollar buyout my private equity firm had executed 3 months prior when the club's board quietly panicked over impending bankruptcy. I took a crisp, high-resolution screenshot of the ownership deed clearly showing my signature as the sole majority stakeholder. I attached the image to a text message and addressed it to my father. Then I began to type. "I did not freeze your card, Dad. I terminated your line of credit because I own the building you are standing in. I own the table you ate at. I own the very floor beneath your feet. I paid off the club's debts 3 months ago, which means I hold the right to revoke the memberships of anyone who disrespects my family, and as of tonight you are permanently banned from my property." I stared at the glowing text, my thumb hovering over the send button. A vivid memory flashed through my mind. I was 18 years old, sitting in his cigar-scented home office, crying until I could barely breathe. I had just checked my college fund account to pay my first semester tuition at Howard University, only to find the balance at zero. Calvin had forged my signature and drained every single penny to pay for my brother Jamal's high-priced defense attorney after Jamal was caught embezzling from a local dealership. When I had begged my father to tell me how I was supposed to pay for my education, he had simply adjusted his tie, looked through me as if I were entirely invisible, and delivered a line that had haunted me for over a decade. I typed those exact words at the bottom of my text message. "You told me when I was 18 that my future did not matter because a man's legacy comes first. Consider this my contribution to your legacy. You can wash dishes to pay that $5,000 tab." I hit send. I watched the delivery notification turn to read almost instantly. I could practically visualize the color draining from his face as he zoomed in on the legal deed, the realization hitting him with the force of a freight train, that the daughter he had just publicly discarded was now the landlord of his entire social existence. I watched the typing bubble appear on the screen. It hovered for a few seconds, vanished, and then appeared again as Calvin desperately tried to formulate a response to the absolute destruction of his reality. But before a single word could come through from him, the screen switched to an incoming call. It was not my father. It was not my mother or my brother. The name flashing across my screen belonged to Jamal's wife, Emily. Emily, the white woman, who had married into our family and immediately assigned herself the role of the refined, educated savior. She was the woman who constantly gave me unsolicited parenting advice, who left diet books on my kitchen counter, and who spoke to me with a slow, exaggerated patience, as if my single motherhood was a cognitive impairment. I accepted the call and lifted the phone to my ear, not saying a word. Aisha, Emily said immediately. Her voice was sharp, icy, and completely devoid of her usual performative sweetness. It dripped with a patronizing condescension that made my blood run cold. I do not know what kind of childish tantrum you think you are pulling right now, but you need to stop. Jamal is having a panic attack in the parking lot because your father is screaming at the valet. You are acting completely unhinged. You need to call the club manager right now, apologize for this ridiculous misunderstanding, and pay the bill like a responsible adult. I remained perfectly silent, letting her entitlement fill the space. Emily scoffed, interpreting my silence as submission. I know you are bitter, Aisha. I know it is hard for you to see Jamal and me building a beautiful traditional family while you struggle on your own. But trying to sabotage your father's business dinner just to get attention is pathetic. You need to know your place. If you do not fix this in the next 3 minutes, I am calling my uncle's law firm. We will sue you for financial sabotage and emotional distress, and I promise you, we will take every last dime of whatever little savings you have managed to scrape together. I listened to her breathe heavily into the receiver, waiting for me to apologize, waiting for me to back down. But the woman she was trying to intimidate simply did not exist anymore. The ringing of the phone sliced through the quiet serenity of my penthouse. I glanced at the caller ID flashing brightly against the dark marble of my kitchen island. It was Emily. My brother Jamal had married her 5 years ago, bringing her into the Washington family fold, where she immediately anointed herself as the ultimate authority on how we should all behave. Emily came from generational Connecticut wealth, and she carried her privilege like a loaded weapon. My parents, desperate for proximity to her family's old money status, allowed her to disrespect me openly and consistently. I picked up the phone and accepted the call. I did not offer a greeting. I simply lifted the device to my ear and listened to the sound of her jagged, furious breathing. I do not know what kind of childish tantrum you think you are pulling right now, but you need to stop. Emily spoke with a clipped, shrill urgency. Her voice was utterly devoid of the sugary sweetness she usually weaponized at family gatherings. She sounded like a woman accustomed to speaking to the hired help, snapping her orders and demanding immediate compliance. Jamal is having a panic attack in the parking lot because your father is screaming at the valet. You are acting completely unhinged. You need to call the club manager right now, apologize for this ridiculous misunderstanding, and pay the bill like a responsible adult. I leaned against the cool edge of the counter, tracing the rim of my crystal water glass with my index finger. I remained absolutely silent. In the world of high-stakes private equity, silence is a mirror. It forces the person across from you to look at their own desperation. Emily hated silence. She interpreted my lack of response as submission, assuming I was simply too intimidated to speak back to her. I know you are bitter, Aisha, she scoffed, her tone dropping into a thick, patronizing sneer. I know it is incredibly hard for you to see Jamal and me building a beautiful traditional family while you struggle to keep your head above water on your own. But trying to sabotage your father's business dinner just to get attention is pathetic. You need to know your place. Know your place. The phrase echoed in the massive vaulted space of my living room. For over a decade, my place in Emily's mind was at the very bottom of the social hierarchy. I was the cautionary tale. I remembered the baby shower Aaliyah had thrown for me 6 years ago, an event Emily attended only to hand me a garbage bag full of stained, used baby clothes from her sister. She had patted my pregnant belly and told me that single motherhood was a tragedy, but I could always rely on Jamal for a handout if things got too rough. She had always viewed my independence as a threat to her narrative of superiority. When her condescension failed to elicit a tearful apology from me, Emily resorted to the ultimate threat she kept in her back pocket. "If you do not fix this in the next 3 minutes," she warned, her voice vibrating with genuine malice, "I am calling my uncle's law firm. We will sue you for financial sabotage and emotional distress. I promise you we will unleash a legal team that will take every last dime of whatever little savings you have managed to scrape together. You will be left with absolutely nothing." I did not raise my voice. I did not match her frantic, volatile energy. I walked slowly to my home office area, overlooking the glittering lights of downtown Atlanta. I pulled open my laptop and typed in my encrypted executive passcode. The screen illuminated my face in the darkened room. While Emily continued her vicious, breathless rant about my failures, I accessed the central database for Vanguard acquisitions. 2 months ago, when my firm first targeted Calvin's logistics company for a potential hostile takeover, I deployed a team of elite forensic accountants to strip his financial records down to the studs. I wanted to know exactly why his massive, once profitable enterprise was currently hemorrhaging cash at an unsustainable rate. What my team found was not poor market conditions. It was not bad investments. It was a staggering multi-million-dollar trail of theft. I opened my email client and pulled up a pre-drafted message addressed directly to Emily's personal inbox. Attached to the email was a highly classified 70-page PDF document. It contained a comprehensive map of offshore routing numbers, shell company registrations, and time-stamped wire transfers. It detailed precisely how Emily and Jamal had been systematically skimming capital from my father's corporate operating accounts for over 3 years. They had used Calvin's dying company as their personal piggy bank. The money they stole funded the deposit on their waterfront mansion. It paid for the designer pearls Emily wore to dinner tonight. It covered the leases on their matching luxury vehicles. They were masquerading as the golden, successful couple looking down their noses at a single mother while actively bleeding their own family dry. "I am going to destroy you in court," Emily continued to scream through the phone, completely oblivious to the digital execution I was currently orchestrating. "We are going to take custody of Zuri if we have to. We will prove to a judge that you are financially and mentally unfit to raise a child. You will not ruin my family." I moved the cursor over the send button and clicked it. A small green notification immediately popped up on my screen, confirming the massive file had been successfully delivered to her inbox. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the absolute certainty of my power settle into my bones. "You should worry less about my finances, Emily," I said softly. My voice was a calm, icy blade cutting straight through her hysteria. She stopped talking abruptly. The sheer authority in my tone caught her completely off guard. "And you should worry a lot more about the SEC audit my firm just triggered on your joint embezzlement accounts," I finished. I heard a sharp, panicked intake of breath on the other end of the line. The arrogant savior complex fractured, instantly replaced by the raw, naked terror of a woman realizing her entire world was about to collapse. "What did you just—" she stammered, her voice shaking violently. I did not wait for her to finish the question. I tapped the red button on my screen and hung up the phone while she was mid-stutter. The quiet returned to my penthouse, absolute and unbroken. The silence in my penthouse the next morning was beautifully unbroken, but I knew the blast radius of my actions was already tearing through my family's manufactured reality. By Sunday morning, the panic had fully set in, but instead of reflection or apology, my family chose their favorite weapon. They doubled down. For the Washington family, the megachurch they attended in the affluent suburbs of Atlanta was not a place of worship. It was a networking event, a weekly fashion show, and the ultimate court of public opinion. I did not need to be sitting in the pews to know exactly what was happening. My former college roommate, who still attended the church, texted me, play-by-play updates from the third row. My mother Yvonne and my sister Aaliyah had arrived early, dressed in their finest Sunday pastels, launching a highly coordinated smear campaign before the choir even finished the opening hymn. Aaliyah strategically cornered the wives of the country club board members near the fellowship hall. She plastered a look of deep sisterly tragedy across her face, whispering loud enough for anyone nearby to hear. She spun a frantic narrative that I was a desperately broke, bitter woman whose small business was failing. According to Aaliyah, I had shown up to the holiday dinner to extort our father for cash, and when he righteously refused to enable my bad financial habits, I threw a childish tantrum and stormed out. Yvonne played her part flawlessly. She dabbed at dry eyes with a lace handkerchief, telling the church elders that they were praying for my mental health. She painted herself as the weeping, devoted matriarch whose heart was simply broken by her eldest daughter's jealousy. They carefully omitted the fact that Calvin had publicly humiliated a 6-year-old child. They erased Zuri from the narrative, entirely reducing her tears to a footnote in their desperate scramble to protect Calvin's reputation. They relied on the congregation's absolute willingness to believe that an unmarried black mother was naturally unstable and desperate. I sat at my kitchen island, sipping a shot of espresso, watching Zuri color a picture book in the morning sunlight. I felt no anger toward their lies. When you hold all the cards, the desperate flailing of your opponents is just background noise. My phone buzzed on the counter. It was a voicemail from Yvonne. I put it on speaker, letting her perfectly modulated voice fill the room. Aisha, Yvonne began, her tone vibrating with righteous indignation. I hope you are happy with the absolute scene you caused. Your father is sick with stress. You are ruining this family's immaculate image over a simple lesson in discipline. Zuri needs to learn how the real world works, and you coddling her is doing that child no favors. And whatever insane lies you are spinning to Emily about federal audits, you need to stop right now. You are trying to tear Jamal's marriage apart because you are miserable and alone. We have sacrificed everything to give you a good name, and this is how you repay us. Grow up, Aisha. The voicemail clicked off. She had entirely bypassed the cruelty inflicted on her granddaughter, prioritizing the preservation of their country club status over a child's broken heart. She had confirmed everything I already knew. There was nothing left to save here. I forwarded the audio file to my lead attorney to add to the harassment dossier and poured myself another espresso. Meanwhile, across town, Calvin was realizing that his reputation was the least of his problems. The corporate line of credit I had severed at the country club was just the first domino. By Monday morning, Calvin's logistics company, Washington Freight, was staring down the barrel of total insolvency. For years, Calvin had operated his business on the assumption that cash flow would always be there to mask his extravagant personal spending. But with Jamal skimming millions from the operating accounts to fund his lavish lifestyle with Emily, the company's foundation was entirely hollow. When the country club accounts froze, Calvin's corporate bank flagged his portfolio. Creditors began calling. Fuel suppliers demanded immediate payment for his fleet of trucks. Payroll was due by the end of the week, and the accounts were devastatingly empty. Calvin was a man drowning, thrashing wildly to keep his head above water. He needed a massive injection of capital, and he needed it before the industry realized Washington Freight was a sinking ship. He instructed his desperate financial team to reach out to every major private equity firm in the country, begging for a buyout or a majority stake investment. He needed a savior. And Vanguard Acquisitions, a notorious aggressive firm known for swallowing failing companies whole, took the bait. Calvin received an email from Vanguard's acquisitions department on Tuesday morning, agreeing to an emergency high-stakes meeting to discuss buying Washington Freight. The meeting was set for Thursday afternoon at Vanguard's corporate headquarters in Chicago. Calvin was ecstatic. He truly believed his self-made man persona, his booming voice, and his tailored suits would be enough to charm the mysterious, unnamed CEO of Vanguard into writing a blank check. He was so desperate to present a united, successful front that he forced Jamal and Emily to fly to Chicago with him. He wanted to show the Vanguard executives that Washington Freight was a strong family legacy, a generational empire ready to scale. They did not fly first class. With the corporate cards frozen and Emily's embezzled funds temporarily locked down by the looming threat of my SEC audit, they were forced to fly commercial coach. The tension between the three of them was reportedly suffocating. Emily was furious, whispering furiously to Jamal about her ruined reputation. Jamal was sweating, terrified that the audit I had promised was already closing in on him. Calvin was barking orders, treating the flight attendants like his personal servants, desperately trying to maintain the illusion of power while his kingdom crumbled around him. When they arrived at the Vanguard Acquisition skyscraper in downtown Chicago, the biting wind off Lake Michigan was nothing compared to the cold, imposing atmosphere of the building. The lobby was a cathedral of modern wealth, all imported Italian marble, brushed steel, and silent, efficient staff. Calvin gave his name to the front desk with his chest puffed out, demanding to speak to the CEO immediately. The receptionist offered a polite, knowing smile and escorted them to the top floor. They were led into a massive glass-walled boardroom that overlooked the entire Chicago skyline. The room was freezing. The sprawling mahogany table was polished to a mirror finish. Calvin took a seat near the center, adjusting his tie and trying to look authoritative. Jamal sat next to him, his knee bouncing nervously under the table. Emily sat on the other side, crossing her arms, and looking around the minimalist room with thinly veiled disdain, still furious that she had been dragged into Calvin's financial mess. They sat in silence for 20 agonizing minutes. They drank the sparkling water provided by the assistants. They checked their watches. The heavy silence of the room was designed to strip away their confidence, to make them realize exactly how small they were in the grand scheme of actual liquid power. Calvin began to sweat. He leaned over to Jamal, hissing under his breath that they needed to pitch the regional expansion first, that they could not let Vanguard see how desperate they truly were. Then the heavy double doors at the end of the boardroom finally clicked open. Calvin, Jamal, and Emily all snapped their heads toward the entrance, putting on their best, most obsequious corporate smiles, ready to grovel to the billionaire who was about to save their lives. The doors swung wide. I walked into the room wearing a sharply tailored midnight blue Tom Ford suit. The sharp click of my stiletto heels echoed off the glass walls like gunshots. Flanking me on my left and my right was a team of 4 ruthless, unsmiling corporate attorneys carrying thick black leather portfolios. I did not break my stride. I did not blink. I walked directly toward the head of the mahogany table, looking straight into the terrified, bloodless faces of the family who had thrown my daughter away just 5 days ago. For a long, agonizing moment, the only sound in the massive boardroom was the low hum of the ventilation system. Calvin stood frozen halfway out of his chair. His hand, which had been reaching for his water pitcher, hovered uselessly in midair. Jamal looked like he had been struck by lightning, his jaw visibly slack. Emily simply stared, her eyes darting between my tailored suit and the 4 imposing attorneys flanking me. The sheer impossibility of the visual in front of them short-circuited their brains. They could not process how the family scapegoat had bypassed the fortress of security on the ground floor. Calvin blinked rapidly, his mind desperately grasping for a reality he could understand. His patriarchal conditioning kicked in, providing him with the only logical explanation his ego would allow. He assumed I had completely lost my mind, followed them from Atlanta, and intercepted the Vanguard legal team in the lobby. He genuinely believed the men in dark suits behind me were here for him, and that I was merely a hysterical distraction. Calvin let out a sharp, nervous laugh. He buttoned his suit jacket and stepped around his chair, puffing out his chest to project maximum authority. He completely ignored me and extended a hand toward my lead counsel, Marcus. "I sincerely apologize for this disruption, gentlemen," Calvin said, his voice booming with forced joviality. "This is my estranged daughter. She has a history of emotional outbursts and deeply inappropriate timing. I will have building security escort her out immediately so we can begin the actual negotiations. We are very eager to speak with your chief executive officer." Marcus did not take my father's hand. He did not even look at him. Instead, Marcus stepped forward, pulled out the heavy leather executive chair at the absolute head of the mahogany table, and waited. I walked past my father close enough for him to smell my perfume and took my seat. My legal team fanned out, taking the seats immediately to my left and right, forming an impenetrable wall of corporate hostility. I crossed my legs, rested my forearms on the polished wood, and stared down the length of the table. Calvin slowly lowered his extended hand. The nervous smile melted off his face, replaced by a deep, dark flush of anger. He marched back to his seat, slamming his hands down on the table. "Get out, Aisha!" Calvin snapped, his voice dropping into a harsh, threatening growl. He was desperate to maintain his authority in front of his golden son and his precious daughter-in-law. The adults are doing business here. If you think you can throw a tantrum and crash a high-level corporate buyout just because your feelings got hurt at a country club, you are entirely delusional. You are embarrassing yourself and you are humiliating this family. Now fetch your coat and leave before I have you arrested for trespassing. Emily leaned forward, emboldened by my father's bluster. Her white savior complex flared up instantly, wrapping her arrogance in a thin veil of fake concern. "Aisha, you really need to seek psychiatric help," Emily said, her tone dripping with condescension. "We told you we would deal with your little financial issues later, but bursting into a multi-million-dollar negotiation like a deranged stalker is a new low even for you. Do not ruin Jamal's legacy because you cannot handle your own miserable life." I did not raise my voice. I did not show a single ounce of anger. I simply raised 2 fingers. On my cue, my legal team unzipped their leather portfolios in perfect unison. They extracted thick bound dossiers and slid them precisely across the long table. One landed in front of Calvin, one landed in front of Jamal, one landed directly in front of Emily. "You can stop pretending, Dad," I said, my voice perfectly level and devastatingly calm. "There is no buyout negotiation happening today. There is no white knight coming to save Washington Freight from total insolvency. Your corporate accounts are overdrawn by $4 million. Your fuel providers are putting liens on your fleet by Friday. And your regional expansion plan was nothing but a hastily fabricated spreadsheet designed to trick a larger firm into absorbing your massive catastrophic debt." Calvin's jaw snapped shut. The red flush on his face drained away, leaving a sickly ashen gray in its place. He stared at the closed dossier in front of him as if it were a live explosive. "Where did you get that information?" Calvin breathed. The booming patriarch reduced to a hoarse whisper. "Those are secure internal records. You have absolutely no right to view those files." I leaned back in my chair, projecting absolute comfort in a room designed to intimidate. "Your outdated firewalls were breached by my forensic accounting team in exactly 42 minutes, I replied. "But the debt is only half the story, isn't it? The real tragedy of your precious legacy is why you are bankrupt in the first place." I shifted my gaze to Jamal. My older brother was physically shrinking in his expensive chair. A bead of sweat rolled down his temple. He knew exactly what was inside that folder. "Open page 4, Jamal," I instructed. Jamal did not move. His hands were shaking violently in his lap, so I read it for him. "Over the last 36 months, Washington Freight has been paying exorbitant monthly consulting fees to 3 separate third-party logistics vendors. But those vendors do not exist. They are ghost entities, shell companies registered to a post office box in Delaware. The routing numbers for those shell companies match a private offshore account. And that offshore account is jointly owned by Jamal and Emily Washington." Emily gasped loudly, her hand flying to her chest. She looked at Jamal, her eyes wide with genuine panic. "You said you covered your tracks," she hissed at him, completely abandoning her refined facade and instantly incriminating herself in front of a room full of lawyers. "You said the money was untraceable." Jamal shushed her frantically, but the damage was done. The golden son, the heir apparent to the Washington Empire, had been systematically bleeding his own father dry to fund his luxury lifestyle, his country club dues, and his waterfront mansion. "You stole from me!" Calvin roared, turning on Jamal with a look of pure, unadulterated betrayal. "I drained your sister's college fund to keep you out of prison when you were 19. I gave you a vice president title. You stole millions from your own family." Jamal threw his hands up defensively, stammering out pathetic excuses about needing to maintain his lifestyle, blaming the rising cost of property taxes, and pointing a shaking finger back at Emily, claiming she demanded a certain standard of living. It was a spectacular display of cowardice. The unified front they had weaponized against me just a few days ago was completely disintegrating, collapsing under the weight of their own greed and incompetence. I watched them tear each other apart for a long, satisfying minute. I watched the men who had mocked my career choices realize that their entire existence was a house of cards. I watched the woman who had threatened to take my child realize she was facing federal prison time for wire fraud. But Calvin, ever the narcissist, could not accept defeat. He could not accept that his empire was gone, and he certainly could not accept that I was the one delivering the fatal blow. He abruptly turned his back on Jamal and slammed his fist on the table, trying to summon one last ounce of authority. "This is a family dispute," Calvin barked at my legal team, his eyes wild and desperate. "You gentlemen do not need to witness this. My son's indiscretions are an internal matter that I will handle personally. But Washington Freight is still a viable asset with massive regional infrastructure. I demand to speak to your boss. I am not dealing with a bitter, ungrateful girl. I am here to do business with the head of Vanguard Acquisitions. Bring him out here right now." Marcus, my lead attorney, did not move a muscle. He simply turned his head and looked directly at me, waiting for my instruction. I did not flinch. I slowly picked up the master financial portfolio resting in front of me. I slid it straight down the center of the mahogany table. It glided over the polished surface with a quiet, deadly whisper and stopped precisely against Calvin's knuckles. I looked at the man who had discarded my daughter without a second thought. I looked at the man who had called her a bastard in front of the entire elite of Atlanta. I let a slow, terrifying smile spread across my face. "I am Vanguard Acquisitions, Dad. And I am not here to buy your company. I am here to liquidate it." For a long, agonizing moment, the only sound in the massive Chicago boardroom was the low, steady hum of the climate control system. Calvin stood frozen halfway out of his chair. His hand, which had been reaching for the crystal water pitcher in the center of the table, hovered uselessly in midair. Jamal looked as though all the air had been violently sucked from his lungs, his jaw visibly slack. Emily simply stared, her eyes darting frantically between my tailored suit and the 4 imposing corporate attorneys flanking me. The sheer impossibility of the visual in front of them had completely short-circuited their brains. They could not process how the family scapegoat had bypassed the fortress of security on the ground floor, let alone why I was walking into a multi-million-dollar corporate negotiation as if I owned the building. Calvin blinked rapidly, his mind desperately grasping for a reality he could understand. His deeply ingrained patriarchal conditioning kicked in, providing him with the only logical explanation his ego would allow. He assumed I had completely lost my mind, followed them from Atlanta, and somehow intercepted the Vanguard legal team in the lobby. He genuinely believed the men in dark suits behind me were here for him and that I was merely a hysterical, deeply inappropriate distraction. Calvin let out a sharp, nervous laugh. He buttoned his suit jacket and stepped around his chair, puffing out his chest to project maximum authority. He completely ignored my presence and extended a hand toward my lead counsel, Marcus. "I sincerely apologize for this disruption, gentlemen," Calvin said, his voice booming with forced, sweaty joviality. "This is my estranged daughter. She has a long history of emotional outbursts and deeply inappropriate timing. I will have building security escort her out immediately so we can begin the actual negotiations. We are very eager to speak with your chief executive officer." Marcus did not take my father's hand. He did not even look at him. Instead, Marcus stepped forward, pulled out the heavy leather executive chair at the absolute head of the mahogany table, and waited respectfully for me to take my place. I walked past my father close enough for him to smell my expensive perfume and sat down. My legal team immediately fanned out, taking the seats directly to my left and right, forming an impenetrable wall of corporate hostility. I crossed my legs, rested my forearms on the polished wood, and stared down the length of the table. Calvin slowly lowered his extended hand. The nervous smile melted off his face, replaced by a deep, dark flush of anger. He marched back to his seat, slamming his hands down on the table, desperate to regain control of the room. "Get out, Aisha!" Calvin snapped, his voice dropping into a harsh, threatening growl. He was frantic to maintain his authority in front of his golden son and his precious daughter-in-law. "The adults are doing business here." If you think you can throw a tantrum and crash a high-level corporate buyout just because your feelings got hurt at a country club, you are entirely delusional. You are embarrassing yourself and you are humiliating this family. Now fetch your coat and leave before I have you arrested for trespassing. Emily leaned forward, emboldened by my father's bluster. Her white savior complex flared up instantly, wrapping her arrogance in a thin veil of fake patronizing concern. Aisha, you really need to seek psychiatric help, Emily said, her tone dripping with condescension. We told you we would deal with your little financial issues later, but bursting into a multi-million-dollar negotiation like a deranged stalker is a new low even for you. Do not ruin Jamal's legacy because you cannot handle your own miserable life. I did not raise my voice. I did not show a single ounce of anger. I was entirely surgical. I am Vanguard Acquisitions. Dad, I said, my voice perfectly level and devastatingly calm. And I am not here to buy your company. I am here to liquidate it. The silence that followed was absolute. Calvin's legs seemed to give out beneath him, and he sank heavily back into his chair. I opened my leather portfolio and extracted the master financial audit of Washington Freight. I did not call him Dad again. I addressed him as a failed executive. Your company is 30 days away from complete irreversible insolvency. Calvin, I stated, sliding a copy of the audit down the table. You came here begging for a capital injection, hoping to use your regional expansion plan as collateral to trick us into saving you. But Vanguard does not invest in hollow shells. Your fuel suppliers have filed notices of default. Your commercial leases are 3 months in arrears, and your highly touted Midwest expansion is entirely fictional. Calvin stared at the paperwork, his chest heaving. He looked completely lost, unable to comprehend the numbers staring back at him. I shifted my cold gaze to Jamal, who was currently sweating through his cheap, off-the-rack dress shirt. The reason your empire is collapsing, Calvin, is sitting right next to you. You placed your golden son in charge of operations, believing his gender and his blind obedience made him competent. You gave him the keys to the vault, but your vice president has not been operating anything except a massive money laundering scheme. I pulled out a second stack of papers. Spreadsheets, wire transfer logs, and glossy color-printed photographs. I laid them out on the table like a prosecuting attorney presenting a murder weapon. Let us look at the operational success of your son, I said, tapping the first photograph. It was a picture from Emily's Instagram account. June 12th. Jamal and Emily check into a $10,000 a night overwater villa in the Maldives. June 11th. A corporate wire transfer of exactly $50,000 is routed from Washington Freight's payroll account to a shell company in the Cayman Islands. A shell company registered exclusively to Jamal. Emily gasped loudly, her hand flying to her chest. She looked at Jamal, her eyes wide with genuine panic. I flipped to the next page. October 3rd. Emily posts a photo of a brand new custom-ordered diamond tennis bracelet. The exact same bracelet she wore to the country club last week. October 2nd. $35,000 is siphoned from the corporate vehicle maintenance fund. Your trucks are breaking down on the highway because Jamal is buying his wife jewelry with your operational capital. Over the last 36 months, Washington Freight has been paying exorbitant monthly consulting fees to 3 separate third-party logistics vendors. But those vendors do not exist. They are ghost entities designed to bleed you dry. Calvin slowly turned his head to look at Jamal. The absolute soul-crushing betrayal in his eyes was palpable. For 30 years, Calvin had worshipped the ground Jamal walked on. He had drained my college fund to save Jamal from his own mistakes. He had handed him a legacy on a silver platter, and Jamal had gutted it from the inside out. Is this true? Calvin whispered, his voice completely broken. You stole from me. You stole from our family. Jamal's panic morphed instantly into violent, unhinged rage. He could not handle the exposure. He could not handle being unmasked in front of the father he had manipulated for his entire adult life. The fight-or-flight response kicked in, and he chose fight. He shot out of his chair, knocking it backward into the glass wall with a loud crash. He slammed both fists down on the mahogany table, leaning over the wood, as if he was going to physically attack me. You are a liar! Jamal screamed, spit flying from his mouth. His face was twisted into an ugly mask of fragile masculinity. He completely ignored the mountain of irrefutable bank logs sitting inches from his hands. Instead, he attacked the only target he had ever known how to hit. "You are a bitter, miserable, unmarried mother," Jamal yelled, his voice echoing off the glass. "You have been jealous of me since the day I was born, because Dad actually loved me and knew you were worthless. You expect us to believe you built this firm? Please, you probably tricked some old men into giving you this job. You slept your way into this boardroom because you are nothing but a desperate fraud who could not even keep a man around to raise your kid." Emily chimed in, her voice shrill and desperate as she tried to defend their theft. "We earned that money. Jamal ran that company while you were off having a child out of wedlock. You have no right to judge us." The silence that followed their outburst was deafening. My security details shifted their weight, preparing to step forward and physically remove him from the room, but I raised a single finger to stop them. I did not need protection from a coward. I simply looked up at him, my expression entirely bored. He was a child throwing a tantrum in a room built for titans. I reached back into my portfolio. I bypassed the massive financial audits and the bank statements. I pulled out a single thin manila folder. I rested my hand flat on top of it. I looked directly into Jamal's bloodshot, furious eyes. I slid the folder straight down the center of the polished wood. It stopped perfectly in front of his white-knuckled hands. "Open it," I commanded, my voice slicing through his heavy, ragged breathing. Jamal hesitated, but his arrogance compelled him to look. He flipped open the cover. Resting on top was a legal property deed. He stared at the address printed at the top of the page. It was the address of the multi-million-dollar waterfront estate he had been flaunting for the past 3 years. The grand house he claimed proved his superiority over me, the asset he used to mock my single motherhood. He looked at the ownership line. It did not list his name. It did not list Emily's name. It listed Vanguard Real Estate Holdings. "You have been paying rent to a shell corporation for 3 years, Jamal," I said, watching the reality of his total destruction wash over his face. "Did you really think you bought that house? You have been my tenant. You are evicted." Jamal's hands shook so violently that the thick parchment of the eviction notice rattled against the polished mahogany table. He stared at the bold black ink, his eyes darting frantically back and forth, as if hoping the words would magically rearrange themselves into something less devastating. Beside him, Emily snatched the paper from his grip. Her manicured nails dug into the document. I watched her perfectly curated superior facade shatter into a million pieces. The reality was crashing down on her all at once. The sprawling waterfront estate she had paraded all over social media, the home she used to host her elitist charity galas, the sanctuary where she felt completely insulated from the struggles of the world, belonged entirely to me. I was her landlord. I held the deed, and I was throwing her out into the street. She opened her mouth to speak, to hurl another legal threat, but no words came out. She just looked at Jamal with an expression of pure, unadulterated revulsion. I sat back in my executive chair, my face a mask of absolute calm, watching the Washington family legacy devour itself. But Calvin could not accept this. My father was a man who had built his entire identity on the illusion of absolute control. He had spent 30 years cultivating an image of unquestionable patriarchal authority, demanding submission from his wife, his children, and his peers. To sit in a freezing Chicago boardroom and watch his discarded, unmarried daughter systematically dismantle his empire was a psychological impossibility for him. His mind simply rejected it. Calvin turned away from Jamal in disgust. He did not look at his son with pity or concern. He looked at him like a defective piece of machinery. Then Calvin turned his fury back onto me. He stood up, his massive frame towering over his side of the table, his chest heaving as he tried to physically intimidate me. He adjusted his tie, his hands trembling slightly, but his voice was a booming, desperate roar. "You think this means something," he spat, pointing a thick finger at my face. "You think because you caught your idiot brother stealing that you have somehow won. You think buying a house makes you a titan of industry. You are nothing, Aisha. You are playing dress-up in a fancy suit. I built Washington Freight with my bare hands. It is a regional powerhouse. It is a legacy that survived recessions and market crashes, and it will survive you." I did not blink. I did not lean away from him. I simply kept my eyes locked on his, letting his desperate bluster wash over me. Calvin reached into the breast pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out his phone. His movements were jerky, fueled by pure adrenaline and wounded pride. He was desperate to prove that he did not need me, that a black woman, especially the daughter he had publicly thrown away like garbage, could never hold the ultimate power over his life. I do not need Vanguard acquisitions, Calvin announced to the room, looking directly at my legal team, as if they would somehow side with him. I do not need a firm run by a bitter, spiteful girl. You thought you could corner me here today, Aisha. You thought you could force me into a liquidation because my cash flow is temporarily tied up, but I am always one step ahead. He gripped the phone tightly, a wild, victorious gleam returning to his eyes. I have a backup investor, he bragged, his voice echoing off the glass walls. A premier private equity consortium based out of New York. Real businessmen. Men who understand the value of my logistics network and do not let petty family grievances cloud their financial judgment. They have reviewed my actual operational data, not this doctored audit you put together, and they are ready to wire $10 million in emergency capital right now, today. He wanted to crush me. He wanted to strip away the power I had finally claimed and force me back into the tiny, insignificant box he had built for me when I was a child. He wanted to prove that no matter how far I had climbed, he would always be standing above me looking down. Let me show you how real business is done, little girl, Calvin sneered. He unlocked his screen, dialed a number from his contacts, and placed the phone flat in the exact center of the mahogany table. He pressed the speaker button, ensuring the audio would broadcast loudly and clearly to every corner of the silent boardroom. He wanted me to hear my own defeat. He wanted my attorneys to witness him bypassing my authority with a single phone call to Wall Street. The line rang once. It rang twice. The tension in the room was suffocating. Jamal had stopped breathing, his eyes fixed on the device as if it were a life raft. Emily leaned forward, a desperate, pathetic glimmer of hope reigniting in her eyes. If Calvin secured this $10 million wire, maybe there was still a chance to save Washington Freight. Maybe there was still a chance to protect their embezzled funds and keep their social standing intact. On the third ring, the call connected. The crisp, professional voice of a man echoed through the speaker. David speaking. Calvin leaned over the table, projecting his most commanding, confident tone. He was performing for me, puffing out his chest and smiling a terrifying, triumphant smile. David, it is Calvin Washington. Skip the pleasantries. We are pulling the trigger today. I am sitting in a room with some amateur private equity firm in Chicago who thinks they can strong-arm me into a liquidation. I am done dealing with them. I need you to execute the term sheet we discussed yesterday. Wire the $10 million to the primary Washington Freight operating account immediately. Let us finalize this partnership. Calvin crossed his arms over his chest and looked at me, a smug, deeply arrogant smirk twisting his features. He was waiting for the verbal confirmation that would save his company and simultaneously humiliate me in front of my own executive staff. He was waiting for his ultimate victory. But the confirmation did not come. Instead, an agonizing, heavy silence stretched over the speakerphone. 5 seconds passed. Then 10. The smug smile on Calvin's face began to falter slowly, replaced by a creeping, icy panic. He uncrossed his arms and leaned closer to the phone. David Calvin barked, his voice losing its confident edge. Did you hear me? I said execute the term sheet. The 10 million. Now. A heavy sigh filtered through the speaker, followed by the sound of shuffling papers. When David finally spoke again, his professional tone had completely evaporated. It was replaced by a quiet, deeply uncomfortable hesitation. Calvin, David said slowly, I am sorry. I cannot do that. Calvin froze. The blood completely drained from his face, leaving him looking hollowed out and incredibly old. Behind him, Jamal let out a quiet, strangled noise of absolute despair. Emily squeezed her eyes shut. What do you mean you cannot do that? Calvin demanded, his voice cracking violently. He slammed his hand on the table next to the phone. We have an agreement. We have a finalized term sheet. You told me the capital was liquid and ready to deploy. You told me the risk assessment was cleared. You are going to wire that money. David or I will sue your entire firm for breach of contract. I am sorry, Calvin. David repeated, his voice firming up with a cold, corporate finality. The risk assessment was cleared by my department yesterday, yes. But an hour ago, my boss personally intervened. She reviewed your file, flagged the hostile environment surrounding your primary accounts, and signaled a hard red light on this entire deal. We are pulling out completely. The capital is frozen. We will not be moving forward with Washington Freight under any circumstances. I advise you to seek bankruptcy counsel immediately. Calvin was shaking. His entire body was vibrating with a mixture of terror and unhinged fury. His last lifeline, his ultimate trump card, had just been snapped in half. He leaned so far over the table he was almost shouting directly into the microphone. "We had a deal!" Calvin screamed, the sound echoing harshly off the glass walls. "Who gave the order to pull my funding? Who is your boss?" I did not wait for David to answer. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the mahogany table, and looked directly into my father's panicked, dilated eyes. "David," I said clearly, my voice carrying effortlessly toward the phone. "That will be all. Thank you for your precise execution today. You are dismissed." "Yes, Ms. Washington," David replied instantly, his tone laced with absolute reverence and deep respect. The call disconnected with a sharp click, leaving the boardroom in total, deafening silence. Calvin stared at the dead phone, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. He looked up at me, his mind finally brutally snapping under the weight of the truth. He tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. I smiled, entirely at peace. "You are sitting across from her." The Chicago boardroom was an absolute tomb when I left it. I walked out with my legal team, leaving Calvin gasping for air and Jamal staring blindly at the ashes of his stolen, fraudulent empire. Vanguard acquisitions moved swiftly over the next 48 hours. The liquidation protocols were initiated with brutal efficiency. Washington Freight was stripped down to the studs. Its assets were frozen, its fleet of trucks grounded across 3 states, and its corporate headquarters locked down by federal auditors. The offshore accounts Jamal and Emily had used to siphon millions were flagged and seized just as I promised. Absolute, irrevocable financial ruin had descended upon the Washington family. They had no liquid cash to fight back, no corporate credit cards to hire expensive crisis managers, and absolutely no social capital left in the affluent Atlanta circles they once terrorized. But narcissists do not simply accept defeat, and they certainly do not reflect on their own toxic behavior. When their wallets are emptied and their power is stripped away, they pivot to the only currency they have left: emotional warfare. It was a crisp Tuesday afternoon at Oak Ridge Academy, the elite private elementary school in Buckhead, where I had enrolled Zuri. The afternoon pickup line was a highly choreographed parade of black Range Rovers, gleaming Mercedes SUVs, and silver Porsches. The mothers clustered on the manicured lawns, clutching their iced matcha lattes and exchanging whispered country club gossip. They were a formidable demographic, women who wielded their wealth and traditional family structures like weapons. I stood near the heavy wrought iron gates, enjoying the afternoon sun, waiting for the final bell to ring. I was checking a final email from Marcus confirming that the formal eviction notice had been successfully served to Jamal and Emily at their waterfront estate. As I slipped my phone into the pocket of my tailored trench coat, the atmosphere on the lawn suddenly and violently shifted. A heavy hush fell over the clustered mothers. I turned my head to see Yvonne. My mother did not belong here. She had never once picked Zuri up from school. She had never attended a single parent-teacher conference, a holiday recital, or a bake sale. She had spent the last 6 years treating my daughter as an inconvenient footnote to her perfect family narrative. Yet here she was, marching across the pristine grass, wearing a tragically understated gray cashmere cardigan and clutching a designer lace handkerchief. She looked like a woman walking to a funeral, her face a carefully constructed masterpiece of maternal sorrow. "Aisha," she cried out. Her voice was perfectly pitched, loud enough to cut through the ambient chatter of the courtyard, but trembling with manufactured desperate heartbreak. She stumbled slightly, a brilliant theatrical touch, forcing two nearby mothers to reach out and steady her arms. I did not move an inch. I did not rush to her side. I watched her performance with the clinical detachment of a scientist observing a desperate lab rat. "Oh, my baby," Yvonne sobbed, pressing the handkerchief to her completely dry eyes. "Please, Aisha. Please, you have to stop this. You are tearing our family apart." The other parents were staring openly now, their conversations completely halted. Yvonne was expertly weaponizing their social expectations. In this affluent, highly traditional community, a daughter was expected to submit to her mother, to honor the matriarchy above all else, and to keep ugly family secrets buried under polite smiles and expensive rugs. Yvonne knew exactly what she was doing. She was attempting to use public shame and peer pressure to back me into a corner. "Your father is a broken man, Aisha," she wailed, taking a step closer, her hands outstretched in a pleading, dramatic gesture. "He is having chest pains. Jamal is losing his home. We have nothing left. I know you are angry about what happened at the club, but to destroy your own flesh and blood over a simple misunderstanding, to take away the legacy your father built from the ground up for all of us. Please, I am begging you on my knees right now, drop this liquidation. Let us sit down and heal as a family. Let me hold my granddaughter again. Let us put the pieces back together." The hypocrisy was staggering. This was the same woman who had watched Calvin scream at Zuri over a spilled glass of water and said absolutely nothing. This was the same woman who had left me voicemails threatening to take my child away because I did not know my place. And now she was performing the role of the weeping, devoted grandmother for an audience of strangers. The heavy oak school doors swung open. A flood of uniformed children poured out into the sunlit courtyard. Zuri spotted me instantly, her face lighting up with a brilliant, gap-toothed smile. "Mommy," she yelled, running toward me with her heavy backpack bouncing against her shoulders. I stepped forward smoothly and deliberately intercepting her before Yvonne could even process the movement or attempt to grab her. I wrapped my arms tightly around my daughter, kissing the top of her braided hair. "Did you have a good day, baby?" I asked, my voice warm, steady, and entirely undisturbed by the soap opera unfolding 3 feet away. Zuri nodded enthusiastically, holding up a finger painting of a yellow sun. I smiled, praised her artwork, and took her small hand securely in mine. I did not look at Yvonne. I did not acknowledge the gasping, whispering mothers surrounding us. I simply turned my back on the entire spectacle and walked Zuri toward my waiting car. Yvonne scrambled after us, her low heels clicking desperately and aggressively against the concrete pavement. "Aisha, do not walk away from me. Do not turn your back on your mother," she shrieked, the weeping matriarch routine fracturing rapidly as she realized she was losing her audience. I reached my SUV and opened the heavy rear door. I gently lifted Zuri inside, placing her into her seat. I took my time. I made sure her backpack was tucked away, carefully adjusted the padded straps of her car seat, and clicked the buckle securely into place. I kissed her cheek one more time and closed the door, sealing Zuri safely inside the soundproof, climate-controlled interior. She was completely insulated from the toxicity outside. Only then did I turn around to face the woman who birthed me. With Zuri safely out of earshot and the other mothers keeping a safe distance, Yvonne's face completely transformed. The tragedy evaporated. The fake tears vanished instantly. The tragic stoop of her shoulders snapped into a rigid, aggressive posture. Her features twisted into a mask of pure, venomous hatred. She stepped so close to me that I could see the furious pulse beating in her neck. "You think you are so smart," Yvonne hissed, her voice dropping into a razor-sharp, guttural whisper, meant only for my ears. "You think because you have a little money and a team of lawyers that you can completely dismantle this family and walk away untouched. If you do not stop this liquidation right now, you are going to regret it for the rest of your miserable life." I stared down at her, my expression completely blank. "I am liquidating a fraudulent company, Mother. You should be thanking me for keeping your son out of federal prison." "Money is nothing," Yvonne spat, her eyes wide and manic. "Money is nothing compared to the law. If you do not reverse this by tomorrow morning, I will walk straight into family court. I will file for grandparents' rights. I will stand in front of a judge and tell them about your insane demanding work hours. I will tell them about your ruthless corporate takeovers, your hostile behavior, and your complete utter inability to provide a stable traditional home with a father figure. I will paint you as an unfit, emotionally unstable woman. I will take full custody of Zuriaisha, and I will make sure you never see her again. I watched Yvonne shrink into a gray blur in my rearview mirror as I drove away from the school. Her threats of family court and custody battles hung in the quiet, leather-lined interior of my vehicle, but my pulse did not elevate by a single beat. I knew my mother. Her entire existence was predicated on the manipulation of optics. She believed that because she could weaponize tears in a school courtyard, she could navigate the brutal, unforgiving machinery of the legal system. She was profoundly mistaken. 72 hours later, the consequences of her desperation arrived at the front doors of my penthouse. It was a Friday morning. I was seated at my dining table reviewing a quarterly risk assessment for Vanguard Acquisitions when the private elevator chimed. My head of security, a former intelligence officer named Vance, stepped into the foyer with a tight, unamused expression. He informed me that 2 agents from the Department of Family and Children's Services were waiting in the lobby, accompanied by a police officer. They were demanding immediate entry to conduct a wellness check on my daughter. "Send them up," I said, not looking up from my tablet. When the heavy oak doors opened, 2 investigators stepped into my home. A man and a woman, both wearing cheap, rumpled suits and expressions of hardened authority. The police officer remained by the elevator bank. They took in the sweeping panoramic views of the Atlanta skyline, the imported marble floors, and the museum-quality artwork lining the walls. Their authoritative posture faltered for a fraction of a second, completely disoriented by the sheer scale of wealth surrounding them. This was not the environment they had been dispatched to investigate. Ms. Washington, the female investigator, began pulling a thick file from her briefcase. "We have received a formal expedited complaint regarding the welfare and living conditions of your daughter Zuri. We are required by law to conduct an immediate home inspection and interview you regarding the allegations." I gestured to the plush, custom-upholstered sofas in the center of the living room. "Please have a seat. Can you read the specific allegations on the record?" The male investigator cleared his throat, opening the file. He looked highly uncomfortable, glancing down at a document printed on heavy cream-colored cardstock. The logo at the top belonged to an old-money, deeply conservative Connecticut law firm, Emily's uncle's firm. "The complaint states that you maintain a grueling, erratic schedule as a corporate executive that constitutes active neglect." The investigator read his voice tight. "It alleges that as an unmarried woman without a traditional family structure, you are incapable of providing a stable environment. Furthermore, the report claims the child is routinely left in the care of unpredictable, unvetted strangers, and that your home is a volatile space unfit for a minor." I leaned back against the counter, my face an icy, impenetrable mask. The racist, classist undertones of the report were violently clear. Emily and Yvonne had collaborated to paint me as an absentee, unstable black mother, completely unfit to raise a child because I did not conform to their archaic, submissive definition of family. They had weaponized Emily's generational privilege, using her uncle's prestigious legal letterhead to force the state to knock down my door. They assumed the sheer weight of a white shoe law firm's stationery would intimidate the investigators into removing my daughter immediately. "May I ask who signed that report?" I asked smoothly. The investigator shifted in his seat. "The primary affiant is your mother Yvonne Washington, supported by corroborating statements from your sister Aaliyah Washington and your sister-in-law Emily Washington." I nodded slowly, letting the silence stretch out until the investigators began to squirm. I did not get defensive. I did not raise my voice or launch into a passionate, tearful defense of my motherhood. Emotion is the enemy of strategy. Instead, I walked over to the built-in shelving unit behind my desk and pulled down a pristine leather-bound binder. It was 5 inches thick, meticulously tabbed and indexed. I walked back and placed it directly in the center of the glass coffee table. "Gentlemen," I said, taking a seat opposite them, I am the Chief Executive Officer of Vanguard Acquisitions. I manage billions of dollars in liquid assets. Do you genuinely believe I leave the most valuable person in my life in the hands of unvetted strangers? I opened the binder to the first tab. Here are the background checks, federal clearances, and pediatric CPR certifications for my household staff, including Zuri's primary nanny, who holds a master's degree in early childhood development. I flip to the second tab. Here are Zuri's comprehensive medical records from the premier concierge pediatric clinic in the state, showing she is in the 99th percentile for health growth and cognitive development. I flipped to the third tab. Here are her academic reports from Oak Ridge Academy, alongside the invoices for her private violin instructor, her Mandarin tutor, and her weekly equestrian lessons. I slid the binder toward the female investigator. Finally, you will find the formation documents for 3 separate, irrevocable trusts, established solely in Zuri's name, fully funding her healthcare education and living expenses through the age of 35. You are standing in a fully secured, environmentally controlled penthouse with 24-hour private security. My daughter is currently in the West Wing, completing a guided art therapy session. The investigators stared at the documentation. The female agent flipped through the pages, her eyes widening as she took in the sheer overwhelming volume of proof. The narrative Yvonne and Emily had spun was not just a lie, it was a spectacular, legally actionable fabrication. Ms. Washington, the male investigator, said, his voice entirely stripped of its previous authority. We apologize for the intrusion. This report was flagged as highly credible due to the legal firm attached to it. I am fully aware of how the game is played, I replied, my voice slicing through the room like a scalpel. My family is currently experiencing profound financial ruin as a direct consequence of their own criminal embezzlement, a matter my firm is currently handling. They filed this report as a malicious retaliation tactic. They attempted to use this agency as a weapon to extort me. The female investigator closed the binder, her face flushed with professional embarrassment. The misuse of Child Protective Services is a severe offense, Ms. Washington. Filing a false report with malicious intent can carry criminal penalties. We will be closing this investigation immediately as unfounded. You have every right to pursue legal action against the affiants. Thank you, I said, standing up to signal the end of the meeting. I appreciate your thoroughness. I will have my security escort you out. When the heavy doors clicked shut behind them, the absolute silence returned to my home. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over the sprawling city. My family had crossed the final, unforgivable line. They had tried to take my child. They had attempted to weaponize the state to rip Zuri out of her home just to protect their fragile egos and their stolen wealth. Most people would have immediately filed a restraining order. Most people would have called the police and pressed charges for the fraudulent CPS report. But I was not most people. I was a predator who had just been handed the perfect bait. I walked over to my desk and opened my encrypted email client. I drafted a message addressed to Yvonne, Aaliyah, and Emily. I CC'd my lead counsel Marcus on the thread. I did not mention the CPS visit. I did not threaten them with counter-sues. I crafted an email that radiated defeat. I made my tone sound exhausted, overwhelmed, and cornered. I wrote that the pressure of the last few weeks had become too much. I stated that I was willing to halt the liquidation of Washington Freight, and that I wanted to formally sit down and discuss a mediated custody arrangement regarding Zuri just as Yvonne had demanded. I invited all 3 of them to attend a private mediation session the following morning at the Vanguard corporate legal offices. I hit send and watched the confirmation flash on the screen. They would read that email and pop champagne. Yvonne would believe her masterful performance at the school had broken my spirit. Emily would assume her uncle's threatening letterhead had brought me to my knees. Aaliyah would revel in the belief that the prodigal daughter was finally surrendering to the family hierarchy. They would walk into that mediation room tomorrow morning, utterly convinced that they had won the war. They would sit down at the table expecting me to hand over my company and my child. I smiled, the cold reflection of my face staring back at me in the glass window. They thought they had cornered me. They had no idea they were simply walking into the slaughterhouse. The conference room at Vanguard Acquisition's regional headquarters was a masterpiece of corporate intimidation. Designed with cold slate floors, floor-to-ceiling soundproof glass, and an obsidian table that stretched for 20 feet, it was a room built to make anyone who entered feel incredibly small. At exactly 9 in the morning, my head of security escorted Yvonne, Aliyah, and Emily through the heavy glass doors. They walked in like conquering generals returning from a glorious campaign. They had received my carefully crafted email the night before, the one where I feigned exhaustion and begged for a mediation sit-down regarding Zuri's custody. They had swallowed the bait whole. Yvonne wore a structured cream pantsuit, her posture radiating absolute tyrannical victory. She took her seat near the center of the table, placing her designer handbag on the obsidian surface with a satisfied thud. Aliyah slid into the chair beside her, her face set in a mask of performative concern, though her eyes danced with malicious glee. Emily, however, led the charge. She carried a thick leather portfolio tucked tightly under her arm, undoubtedly packed with legal threats drafted on her uncle's prestigious Connecticut law firm letterhead. She looked positively radiant, completely energized by the prospect of bringing the family outcast to her knees. I sat at the absolute head of the table. I wore a charcoal gray suit, and my expression was a blank, unreadable slate. I did not offer them water. I did not offer them coffee. I simply rested my forearms on the table and waited for them to begin their execution. Emily did not hesitate. She opened her portfolio, smoothed out a stack of heavily highlighted papers, and looked at me with a sickeningly sweet, patronizing smile. "We are so glad you finally saw reason, Aisha." Emily began, her voice dripping with the arrogant certainty of generational wealth. "I know the visit from Child Protective Services was a shock. But you have to understand, we did not file that report out of malice. We did it out of love. We did it because we are genuinely terrified for Zuri's well-being." I did not blink. I let her speak. "In the art of corporate warfare, you always let the opposition exhaust their ammunition before you return fire. You are a fundamentally broken woman, Aisha." Emily continued, her tone shifting from fake sympathy to clinical disdain. "You always have been. You substitute corporate aggression for maternal instinct. You work grueling, erratic hours. You leave your daughter in the care of hired help while you fly across the country playing the ruthless executive. That is not motherhood. That is abandonment." Aliyah nodded vigorously, crossing her arms and looking down her nose at me. "It is pathetic, honestly," Aliyah chimed in. "Zuri is going to grow up completely damaged because she does not have a real family. It is just too much for one woman, Aisha, especially without a man to ground the household. You are completely unstable." Emily tapped her manicured fingernail against her legal pad, drawing the attention back to herself. "Zuri desperately needs a stable traditional foundation," she lectured, her voice rising with self-righteous authority. "She needs a mother who is actually present, and she needs a strong, dependable father figure. Jamal and I have spent the last 5 years building exactly that. We have a secure, loving two-parent household. We have the resources, the emotional stability, and the moral grounding that your home entirely lacks." Yvonne finally spoke, leaning forward to deliver her matriarchal decree. "We are simply correcting a mistake, Aisha. You should never have brought a child into your chaotic, isolated life. You have proven that you cannot handle it. We have the paperwork ready. You will sign over primary physical and legal custody to me, with Jamal and Emily acting as co-guardians in their home. You will be allowed supervised visitation on alternating weekends. If you fight us, Emily's uncle will tie you up in family court until you are bankrupt. Sign the papers and we can all move forward." Silence descended upon the cold boardroom. I looked at the three women sitting across from me. They were absolutely drunk on their own perceived power. They genuinely believed that their weaponized tears, their racist CPS reports, and their elitist legal threats had broken me. They believed that because I was a single black woman, I would naturally bow to the traditional patriarchal structures they worshipped. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the icy air of the room fill my lungs. "Are you quite finished?" I asked. My voice was a soft, deadly whisper that barely carried across the length of the table, yet it commanded absolute authority. Emily scoffed, leaning back in her chair and crossing her arms. We are finished when you sign the custody transfer, Aisha. Stop stalling. You have no cards left to play. I did not defend my motherhood. I did not justify my working hours, nor did I explain the immaculate, loving environment I had built for my daughter. My worth as a mother did not require the validation of three women who had spent their entire lives tearing me down. Instead, I reached down to the floor and unclasped my leather briefcase. You speak very highly of your stable family dynamics, Emily, I said smoothly. You rely very heavily on the illusion of your perfect traditional marriage. You build your entire argument for taking my daughter on the premise that Jamal is a dependable moral father figure. I pulled a thick, heavy manila envelope from my briefcase. I slid it down the center of the obsidian table. The thick paper made a quiet scratching sound as it glided across the polished surface. It stopped exactly 1 inch from Emily's folded hands. Before you try to take my child, Emily, I said, my voice dropping an octave, carrying the finality of a judge delivering a death sentence. You should meet Jamal's. Emily stared at the envelope. Her smug, victorious smile flickered, a sudden shadow of confusion passing over her eyes. Aaliyah uncrossed her arms, her brow furrowing. Yvonne sat perfectly still. Emily slowly reached out. She pulled the metal clasp back and flipped open the flap of the envelope. She reached inside and pulled out a stack of 8 by 10 glossy photographs, accompanied by a thick stack of bank statements. She looked at the first photograph. The color instantly drained from her face, leaving her skin an ashen, sickly gray. The picture was taken at a public park across town, far away from the country clubs and elite gated communities Emily frequented. In the center of the frame was Jamal. He was laughing, pushing a toddler on a bright red swing. The little boy was perhaps 2 years old, with Jamal's exact eyes and smile. Standing right next to the swing, leaning her head affectionately against Jamal's shoulder, was a stunning, dark-haired woman. Emily's hands began to shake violently. The photograph slipped from her fingers, revealing the next image underneath. It was Jamal kissing the same woman on the forehead outside a pediatrician's office, holding the little boy in his arms. No, Emily gasped. The sound was entirely hollow, the air rushing out of her lungs. No, this is a lie. This is a fake. You had this manufactured. Look at the financial statements underneath the photos, Emily. I instructed, my voice entirely devoid of mercy. Emily blindly shoved the photographs aside, her trembling fingers grabbing the thick stack of financial documents. She stared at the highlighted rows of numbers. When my forensic accounting team audited Washington Freight, they traced the money Jamal was embezzling to an offshore shell company, I explained calmly, watching her world burn to the ground in real time. But my team is exceptionally thorough. They did not just stop at the corporate accounts. They traced the outgoing wires from that shell company. Jamal was not just using his father's stolen money to pay the rent for his second family's townhouse. He was using yours. Emily let out a sharp, ragged sound, pressing a hand to her mouth. Look at the routing numbers, Emily, I said, pointing at the page she was holding. Look at the crest printed at the top of those transferred statements. Jamal bypassed your personal accountants 18 months ago. He forged your signature on a secondary authorization form. He has been systematically funneling hundreds of thousands of dollars directly out of your Connecticut Heritage Trust. Your generational wealth, the money you use to look down on me, has been paying for the private preschool, the luxury leased vehicle, and the living expenses of Jamal's other woman and his secret son. Aaliyah snatched the papers out of Emily's hands, her eyes widening in absolute horror as she saw the undeniable, irrefutable proof of her brother's double life. Yvonne covered her mouth with her lace handkerchief, a genuine, unscripted noise of devastation escaping her throat. The perfect traditional family they had weaponized against me was a complete, rotting fraud. Jamal had not only stolen their money, he had made a mockery of the very institution they claimed made them superior. Emily opened the envelope wider. It contained photos and financial statements proving Jamal has a secret second family across town, funded entirely by the money Emily inherited from her family. Emily's scream shattered the heavy silence of the boardroom. It was not a cry of sorrow. It was a guttural, primal sound of absolute, unhinged rage. She snatched the glossy photographs and the damning bank statements off the table and hurled them directly at Jamal's face. The heavy paper struck his cheek, scattering images of his secret toddler and his smiling mistress across the polished obsidian surface. Jamal scrambled backward his chair, scraping violently against the slate floor. "Emily, wait, listen to me," he stammered, his hands raised in a pathetic, trembling gesture of defense. "It is not what it looks like, I can explain." "Explain what?" Emily shrieked, her voice echoing off the soundproof glass. "Explain that you used my grandfather's trust fund to buy a Mercedes for another woman. Explain that you have been playing house across town while lecturing Aisha about traditional family values." She lunged forward, grabbing the lapels of his expensive suit. "I will ruin you, Jamal. I will leave you with absolutely nothing." Yvonne sat frozen, her face buried in her hands, moaning in absolute denial. Aaliyah was backed against the wall, staring at her brother as if he had grown a second head. The moral high ground they had marched in with had evaporated instantly, leaving behind a toxic, festering crater of their own making. I calmly reached forward, snapped the golden clasps of my briefcase shut, and stood up. I looked down at Emily, who was now hysterically sobbing while hitting Jamal's chest, and then over to Yvonne, whose entire world had just collapsed. "I believe this mediation has concluded," I said smoothly. "If you wish to discuss custody again, my lawyers will be waiting. Have a wonderful morning." I turned and walked out of the boardroom, my legal team flanking me. Behind the heavy glass doors, the Washington family tore itself to shreds. The fallout was swift and merciless. Emily filed for a highly publicized scorched earth divorce less than 24 hours later. She froze every joint account, locked Jamal out of the waterfront estate, and unleashed her uncle's law firm to seek criminal charges against him for financial fraud. Aaliyah went completely silent, fleeing back to her apartment and refusing to take Yvonne's calls. The United Family Front was dead. With Jamal buried in the litigation and Washington Freight fully liquidated under Vanguard's control, my father was left with nothing. His company was gone. His son was a disgraced pariah. His wife was a hysterical wreck. But Calvin Washington was a man who lived and breathed for optics. He was obsessed with respectability politics, driven by a desperate need to project dominance and success to the outside world. He simply could not process his own defeat. In his distorted, narcissistic mind, he believed he could still win if he just found the right audience. He thought if he shamed me publicly, leveraging the old-school expectations of the black elite, I would crumble and surrender my assets to avoid the embarrassment. He chose New Year's Eve for his final desperate play. The annual Black Excellence Gala was the crown jewel of Atlanta's social calendar. It was an invitation-only event held in the Grand Ballroom of the St. Regis, a gathering of the city's most powerful politicians, tech innovators, and business titans. This was the room Calvin had spent his entire life trying to buy his way into. I was not just a guest, I was a platinum sponsor. I sat at the center VIP table wearing a floor-length emerald silk gown that caught the light of the massive crystal chandeliers above. The table was draped in black velvet and covered in white orchids. I was sipping vintage champagne, deep in conversation with the mayor and the CEO of a major telecommunications firm. I belonged here. I had built my empire with my own hands, and this room recognized my power. It was exactly 11:15. The live jazz band was playing a smooth, upbeat melody. The room was filled with the clinking of crystal and the low, elegant murmur of the city's elite. Then the heavy brass doors at the back of the ballroom burst open. The disruption was immediate. I saw the flash of movement out of the corner of my eye. Calvin was marching across the immaculate carpet, his face flushed a dangerous mottled red. He was wearing an ill-fitting tuxedo that looked 10 years out of date. His chest heaved with manic, uncontrolled energy. He was physically dragging Yvonne by the wrist. She stumbled behind him in a dated sequined dress, her face streaked with tears, playing the role of the battered, heartbroken matriarch perfectly on cue. They pushed past a waiter, knocking a silver tray of champagne flutes to the floor with a loud, shattering crash. The music faltered. Heads began to turn. Calvin did not care. He spotted me sitting at the center table and locked onto me like a heat-seeking missile. He stormed across the dance floor, ignoring the shocked gasps of the city's most influential people. He wanted a spectacle. He wanted to corner me where I could not escape, forcing me to submit to avoid public shame. He reached my table and slammed his heavy fist down onto the velvet tablecloth, causing the crystal glasses to jump and rattle. "There she is," Calvin bellowed, his voice echoing violently across the cavernous ballroom. "Take a good look at her, the woman who destroyed her own flesh and blood." The mayor blinked, leaning back in his chair in absolute shock. The telecommunications CEO stared at Calvin as if he were a rabid animal. I did not flinch. I slowly set my champagne flute down, my eyes locking onto my father's manic gaze. "You think you can sit here among decent, hardworking people?" Calvin screamed, pointing a thick, trembling finger directly at my face. He was sweating profusely, the stage lights reflecting off his forehead. "You think wearing a fancy dress makes you a titan of industry? You are a thief, a liar and a thief. You stole Washington freight from me. You manipulated the law, you forged documents, and you stole the legacy I built with my bare hands." Yvonne collapsed against a nearby chair, burying her face in her hands and sobbing loudly. "My baby," she wailed, making sure her voice carried to the surrounding tables. "How could you do this to us, Aisha? We gave you everything, we loved you, and you threw us out on the street." It was a masterclass in manipulation. They were weaponizing their own humiliation, betting that the highly conservative, respectability-obsessed crowd would turn against the unnatural daughter who dared to usurp her father. Calvin puffed out his chest, looking around at the silent, staring guests. He believed he had the high ground. He believed he had finally exposed me. "Security!" Calvin roared, turning toward the ballroom doors. "I demand that you remove this woman from the premises immediately. She is a criminal. She embezzled millions from her own family, and she does not belong in this room." The jazz band stopped playing completely. The ambient chatter of 500 guests vanished. The silence in the grand ballroom was absolute, deafening, and heavier than concrete. Calvin stood tall, a triumphant, vicious smirk beginning to form on his lips. He was waiting for the guards to rush in. He was waiting for the crowd to erupt in whispers of disgust directed at me. He was waiting for me to lower my head in shame and beg for a private settlement to make the scene go away. I did not move. I simply looked past him toward the grand stage at the front of the room. A sharp, clear feedback whine echoed through the sound system. The host of the gala, a legendary civil rights icon and billionaire philanthropist, stepped up to the microphone, his face carved from stone as he looked directly at Calvin Washington. The sharp, clear feedback whine of the microphone severed the heavy silence in the grand ballroom. Standing at the podium was Josephine Sterling, a legendary civil rights icon, billionaire philanthropist, and the undisputed matriarch of Atlanta's elite society. She was a woman whose approval Calvin had spent 3 decades desperately trying to buy, constantly donating to her foundations and attending her galas in hopes of a single photograph or a nod of recognition. Josephine adjusted the microphone stand with a calm, deliberate motion. She wore a stunning silver gown, her white hair swept back into an elegant crown. She did not look at Calvin. She did not acknowledge the sweating, unhinged man standing in his outdated tuxedo, nor did she acknowledge Yvonne, who was currently slumped against a velvet chair, whimpering into her hands. To acknowledge a disruption is to give it power, and Josephine Sterling gave power to no one. Instead, Josephine looked directly across the sea of crystal chandeliers and white orchids, her gaze locking onto me at the center VIP table. "Ladies and gentlemen," Josephine began, her deep melodic voice flowing through the state-of-the-art sound system, washing over the 500 frozen guests. "We gather tonight not just to celebrate the passing of another year, but to honor the resilience, the vision, and the undeniable power of Black enterprise in this city. We are here to recognize those who build, those who protect, and those who secure our future for the next generation." Calvin's mouth opened, a confused, wet gasp escaping his throat. He looked around the room, frantically searching the faces of the mayor, the city councilmen, and the corporate executives seated nearby. He was waiting for them to echo his outrage. He was waiting for anyone to stand up and demand that the thief be removed. No one moved. No one even looked at him. Their eyes were fixed entirely on the stage. This year has brought unprecedented economic challenges. Josephine continued, her voice rising with majestic authority. But it has also brought forth a leader of unparalleled strategic brilliance. A woman who took the helm of Vanguard Acquisitions and transformed it into a financial fortress. A woman whose firm recently injected $50 million into minority-owned startups across the Southeast, stabilizing our local supply chain and saving countless jobs. Calvin took a step backward, his heavy black dress shoes sinking into the thick carpet. The blood completely drained from his face. His arms, which had been raised in self-righteous fury just moments before, fell limply to his sides. He was beginning to realize that the room was not turning against me. The room belonged to me. Furthermore, Josephine smiled, her eyes crinkling with genuine warmth as she looked at my table. This gala and the new pediatric wing of the Sterling Children's Hospital that we are funding tonight would not have been possible without the unprecedented, staggering generosity of our primary benefactor. The silence in the ballroom shifted from shock to awe. The tension dissolved into a collective electric anticipation. "It is my absolute honor and my distinct privilege," Josephine announced, raising her hands to the crowd to introduce our primary platinum sponsor, the savior of our hospital initiative, and the city's newly named Entrepreneur of the Year. "Please stand and welcome the Chief Executive Officer of Vanguard Acquisitions, Ms. Aisha Washington." The ballroom erupted. 500 of the most powerful, influential people in the state of Georgia rose to their feet in a thunderous, rolling standing ovation. The applause was deafening. The mayor seated to my left stood up and smiled warmly, gesturing for me to take the spotlight. The telecommunications CEO to my right clapped enthusiastically, nodding his profound respect. The sound of clapping hands and cheering voices bounced off the vaulted ceilings and gold leaf moldings. Calvin was caught dead in the center of the crossfire. He stood paralyzed on the edge of the dance floor as the entire room stood up to applaud the daughter he had just tried to publicly execute. His jaw was slack. His eyes were wide and manic, darting wildly around the room as his reality fractured into a million jagged pieces. He was drowning in the sound of my victory. Yvonne had completely stopped crying. She lowered her hands from her face and stared up at the stage, her mouth hanging open in absolute uncomprehending horror. The narrative she had clung to her entire life, the illusion that she and Calvin were the royalty of the family while I was the defective outcast, was being incinerated in front of her very eyes. I did not rush to stand. I took my time. I set my vintage champagne flute down on the table, the crystal base clinking softly against the glass. I picked up my silk clutch. Then I smoothly rose to my feet. The emerald silk of my gown caught the ambient light shimmering as I turned to acknowledge the applause. I offered a gracious, composed nod to Josephine Sterling and a polite smile to the mayor. As the applause began to settle into a sustained, respectful murmur, the heavy brass doors at the back of the ballroom opened once again. 4 men stepped inside. They were massive, broad-shouldered professionals wearing immaculate black suits and discreet earpieces. The St. Regis Executive Security Team. They moved with terrifying synchronized efficiency, cutting through the perimeter of the crowd and marching directly toward the center VIP table. Calvin saw them coming. A sudden, pathetic spark of hope reignited in his desperate eyes. He puffed his chest back out, his hands curling into tight fists. He actually believed in the depths of his profound delusion that the security team was coming to escort me out of the building. He believed that despite the applause, despite the award, his command as a patriarch still carried weight. "Here they come!" Calvin spat, his voice a harsh, wet hiss. He pointed at me again, looking at the approaching guards. "Take her. Get her out of my sight. She is a fraud." The 4 security guards reached the table. They did not even look at me. 2 of the massive men stepped seamlessly around Calvin, flanking him on both sides. The 3rd guard stepped behind Yvonne, towering over her trembling frame. The 4th guard, the head of the detail, stepped directly into Calvin's line of sight, completely blocking his view of my table. "Mr. Washington," the head guard said. His voice was low, devoid of emotion, and carried the hard edge of an absolute order. "You are disrupting a private event. You are trespassing on a secured floor. You and your wife will come with us quietly right now, or the Atlanta Police Department will remove you in handcuffs." Calvin froze. He looked at the guard on his left, then the guard on his right. The massive hands of the security detail clamped down firmly onto Calvin's shoulders, gripping the cheap fabric of his outdated tuxedo with bruising force. "No," Calvin gasped, his voice cracking violently. "No, you do not understand. I am Calvin Washington. I built a regional empire. I belong here. She is the one who needs to be removed." The guards did not argue. They simply tightened their grip and forced him to take a step backward. Yvonne let out a sharp, terrified squeak as the third guard firmly guided her up from her chair, propelling her toward the exit. They were being thrown out. They were being physically dragged out of the most exclusive room in the city, humiliated in front of the exact demographic they worshipped. I turned away from the stage and looked down at my father. Calvin was struggling against the grip of the guards, his shoes scuffing against the carpet. He looked up at me, his face a portrait of utter devastating defeat. The narcissist's ultimate nightmare had been realized. He was powerless, he was irrelevant, and he was being discarded. I let a slow, cold smile touch the corners of my mouth. "You wanted an audience, Dad?" I said, my voice carrying effortlessly through the quiet tension of the surrounding tables. "Now you have one," Calvin snapped, the psychological dam holding back his sanity finally and violently shattered. He realized he had lost the company. He had lost his son. He had lost his wealth. And now he was losing his public dignity. With a sudden animalistic surge of adrenaline, he wrenched his right arm free from the security guard's grip. He lunged forward, not toward me, but toward the center of the dance floor. He reached frantically into the breast pocket of his tuxedo jacket. His hand emerged, clutching a thick, crumpled stack of papers. He waved them wildly above his head, his face contorted in a mask of pure, unadulterated madness. "She forged the initial startup capital." Calvin screamed, his voice tearing through his throat, raw and desperate. He turned in a frantic circle, holding the papers up to the stunned crowd, staking his entire freedom on a complete fabricated lie. "I have the documents right here. I have the proof. She stole from my company. She falsified bank records to build Vanguard. She is a criminal, and I can prove it." The absolute absurdity of Calvin's final scream hung in the crystal-lit air of the St. Regis ballroom for precisely 3 seconds before the heavy brass doors slammed shut behind him. The security detail dragged my father and his weeping wife out into the freezing Atlanta night, severing them from the world of power they so desperately craved. Josephine Sterling did not miss a single beat. She leaned back into the microphone smoothly, transitioning into a toast to the future of Black enterprise, effectively erasing Calvin Washington from the social registry with a polite, dismissive smile. The gala resumed its elegant hum, but the war had officially entered its final fatal arena. Calvin had made his public declaration, and true to the predictable nature of a cornered narcissist, he doubled down on his own delusion. 72 hours later, my legal team was served with a federal lawsuit. Calvin had actually followed through. He filed a civil complaint in the Northern District of Georgia accusing me of corporate espionage, breach of fiduciary duty, and the outright theft of proprietary assets. His filing claimed that Vanguard Acquisitions was built on seed money siphoned directly from Washington Freight's operating accounts a decade ago. It was a spectacular, unhinged work of fiction, completely unsupported by reality, but designed to do exactly one thing: generate a media spectacle. Calvin believed that the threat of a prolonged, highly publicized federal trial would panic my board of directors. He was betting his freedom that I would authorize a multi-million-dollar settlement just to make the headlines disappear and protect Vanguard's pristine corporate image. He did not realize that I had spent my entire life preparing for this exact fight. I sat at the head of the obsidian table in Vanguard's executive war room. The space was a command center of glass and steel, heavily encrypted with digital projections of financial flowcharts glowing on the interactive walls. My lead counsel Marcus sat to my right, flanked by 3 senior litigators and a dedicated team of forensic accountants. Spread out across the massive table were the contents of the initial discovery boxes Calvin's legal representation had frantically submitted to the court. What fascinated me most about this pathetic legal maneuver was not the fabricated claims but the name listed as Calvin's primary counsel, Emily Washington. Emily was drowning, and she was dragging Calvin down with her. Following the catastrophic mediation session where I exposed Jamal's secret family, Emily's pristine country club reality had violently shattered. She had filed for a scorched earth divorce, freezing the few remaining assets tied to her marriage. But Jamal's embezzlement had already bled her Connecticut Heritage Trust dry to fund his mistress. Emily was suddenly facing the terrifying prospect of true financial ruin. The waterfront estate was locked in litigation, her credit lines were severed, and her wealthy New England family, abhorring the public scandal, had cut her off entirely. Desperation breeds catastrophic mistakes. Emily, a woman who had not practiced active law in 5 years, had reinstated her credentials simply to act as Calvin's attack dog. She was banking her entire survival on securing a percentage of whatever settlement they could extort from me. Her panic was evident in the sloppy, erratic nature of the federal complaint. She had filed motions riddled with formatting errors, citing outdated corporate statutes, and relying on emotionally charged rhetoric rather than actionable evidence. She was throwing legal spaghetti at the wall, hoping a federal judge would mistake her frantic noise for a legitimate grievance. "They are trying to drown us in paper," Marcus said, tossing a thick, disorganized binder onto the table. It landed with a heavy thud. Emily has submitted over 4,000 pages of internal Washington freight ledgers, retroactive board minutes, and alleged expense reports. She even submitted raw data dumps from their servers, including encrypted zip files, absurdly saved under the default export names A1_15, A2_15, and A3_15. She claims these documents prove you manipulated their accounting software to funnel startup capital into Vanguard. It is a complete phishing expedition. They want us to look at this mountain of garbage and decide it is cheaper to pay them off than to pay us to audit it. I picked up a stack of the submitted papers, my eyes scanning the columns of numbers and the hastily photocopied bank seals. I could see the subtle inconsistencies immediately. Dates that did not align with corporate banking holidays. Transfer authorization signatures that looked slightly too uniform, as if they had been digitally superimposed. Emily and Calvin had doctored these records, fabricating a financial history to frame me. They had spent the weekend locked in Calvin's study, altering ledgers to make me look like a thief. "They think we are going to run from a fight," I said, my voice completely devoid of warmth. "They think we are afraid of the mud." I dropped the papers back onto the table and looked directly at the lead forensic accountant, a fiercely intelligent woman named Sarah, who possessed a terrifying eye for numerical anomalies. "Do not settle," I instructed the room, my tone slicing through the quiet hum of the war room. "I do not care if it takes 100 billable hours. I want every single page of this submitted evidence torn down to the atomic level. Cross-reference their doctored ledgers with the federal banking records we subpoenaed during the liquidation. Track every routing number, every phantom transfer, and every missing decimal point. Calvin Washington wants to play federal games with forged documents. Let us show him what happens when he invites the federal government into his own house." The legal team went to work. For the next 4 days, the Vanguard War Room operated around the clock. The air was thick with the smell of black coffee and the sharp, focused energy of professionals dismantling a fraud. I maintained my daily CEO duties, commanding board meetings, and executing corporate acquisitions with effortless grace while my team systematically gutted Calvin's last desperate play. Emily continued to fire off aggressive, demanding emails to Marcus, threatening to leak the lawsuit to the financial press if we did not agree to a preliminary settlement conference. She demanded $10 million and a complete reversal of the Washington freight liquidation. Her emails were dripping with the arrogant entitlement of a woman who genuinely believed her proximity to whiteness and her law degree made her untouchable. I instructed Marcus to ignore every single message, let her scream into the void. Let the panic set in as the silence from our camp stretched on. It was late Thursday evening. The Atlanta skyline was glittering outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, a sea of gold and white lights against the velvet dark. I was reviewing a quarterly earnings report when the heavy glass door to the war room slid open. Marcus walked in accompanied by Sarah. The atmosphere in the room instantly and irrevocably shifted. Sarah was not carrying the chaotic, disorganized binders Emily had submitted. She was carrying a single slim manila folder with a bright red federal compliance sticker affixed to the front. Her hands were perfectly steady, but her eyes held the dark electric gleam of a hunter who had just uncovered the ultimate kill. Marcus looked pale, his usual calm, cynical demeanor replaced by a state of absolute staggering shock. He walked slowly to the head of the table and placed the red-tabbed folder directly in front of me. "Ms. Washington," Marcus said, his voice dropping to a harsh, controlled whisper. "We followed your instructions. We cross-referenced the digital discovery files Emily and your father submitted against the historical banking data from Washington Freight's primary lenders." I looked at the folder, then up at my lead counsel. "And what did you find?" "Sloppy Photoshop forged authorizations." Sarah stepped forward, resting her hands on the back of a leather chair. "We found the forgeries, Ms. Washington. Emily did doctor the expense reports to make it look like capital was bleeding out to your accounts. It was amateur work. But in their rush to bury us in paperwork, in their absolute blind panic to create this mountain of fake evidence, they made a catastrophic error." She tapped a manicured finger against the red folder. "When Emily pulled the historical accounting data from Washington Freight's internal servers to doctor the numbers, she did not realize she was accessing the shadow ledgers." Sarah explained, her voice ringing with deadly clarity. "Calvin did not just keep one set of books, he kept two. And Emily, in her frantic attempt to frame you, accidentally exported the raw, unredacted secondary ledgers and submitted them directly into federal discovery." I leaned forward, my heart beating in a slow, powerful rhythm. The puzzle pieces were suddenly aligning, forming a picture far more devastating than a simple family shakedown. Marcus looked down at me, shaking his head in sheer disbelief at the magnitude of Calvin's arrogance. "Ms. Washington," Marcus said, the gravity of the situation settling heavily over the war room, "we did not just find proof of forgery to dismiss this lawsuit. We found a 20-year trail of ghost payrolls, offshore shell companies, and systematically hidden assets. Your father has been defrauding the Internal Revenue Service since before you were in high school. We found a 20-year trail of tax fraud." The silence that followed was absolute. Calvin Washington, the man who demanded perfection, who worshipped respectability, and who had discarded me for not fitting into his pristine image, had built his entire legacy on a federal crime. And Emily, the arrogant, desperate heiress, had just legally submitted the confession directly to the federal courts. I opened the red folder, my eyes scanning the highlighted columns of undeniable criminal tax evasion. The trap had not just snapped shut, it had locked, sealed, and buried them. I smiled, the cold, smooth glass of the boardroom table reflecting my total victory. "Call the United States Attorney's Office," I commanded, my voice echoing like thunder in the quiet room. "Tell them Vanguard Acquisitions would like to turn over state's evidence." The heavy mahogany doors of the Richard B. Russell Federal Building sealed shut with a hollow, echoing thud, trapping the Washington family inside the very arena they had foolishly chosen for their final stand. The courtroom was a sprawling cavern of dark oak paneling, polished marble floors, and intimidating silence. It was a space designed to strip away the illusions of wealth and power, reducing every person in the room to the absolute, unvarnished truth. For Calvin Washington, a man whose entire existence was predicated on lies, there could be no more dangerous place on earth. I sat at the defense table, my posture perfectly straight, my hands resting lightly on the polished wood surface. I wore a tailored charcoal blazer and a subtle diamond lapel pin. I did not fidget. I did not look back at the gallery. I simply watched the spectacular, agonizing collapse of the people who had spent my entire life trying to break me. At the plaintiff's table, Emily was visibly unraveling. The arrogant, untouchable Connecticut heiress who had marched into Vanguard Acquisitions weeks ago was gone. In her place stood a desperate, terrified woman trying to play lawyer to save herself from absolute financial ruin. She was sweating profusely, dark patches blooming under the arms of her designer suit. Her hands trembled so violently that the legal pad she was holding rattled against the microphone stand. She was completely out of her depth attempting to navigate federal court protocols she had not studied in years. Calvin, however, sat tall and rigid beside her. He had his chin tilted upward, his chest puffed out, wearing a custom navy suit that he likely could no longer afford. He surveyed the courtroom with the blinding, delusional arrogance of a patriarch who genuinely believed his mere presence commanded respect. He thought the federal judge would look at him, see a respectable black business titan, and immediately rule in his favor. He thought his forged documents were a masterstroke. He was completely oblivious to the fact that he was sitting on a live grenade. In the gallery directly behind them, the remnants of the Washington dynasty huddled together. Yvonne sat stiffly in her pearls, clutching her designer handbag as if it were a life preserver. Jamal sat slouched next to her, looking hollowed out and sickly pale. The reality of his impending divorce, the loss of his corporate salary, and the exposure of his secret second family had drained the life completely out of him. They were a portrait of ruined respectability. "Your Honor," Emily began, her voice cracking as it echoed through the sound system. She cleared her throat and tried again, wiping a bead of sweat from her forehead. "Your Honor, the plaintiff will prove that Aisha Washington engaged in a systematic multi-year campaign of corporate espionage. We have submitted financial ledgers clearly demonstrating that the initial startup capital for Vanguard acquisitions was fraudulently siphoned directly from Washington Freight's operating accounts. She stole from her own father to build her empire." She held up a thick stack of printed spreadsheets, her hands shaking so badly the papers fluttered like leaves in the wind. "These documents represent the undeniable truth of her theft. We are asking the court to freeze all Vanguard assets immediately pending a full federal inquiry." Judge Davies, a formidable woman with sharp eyes and an absolute intolerance for courtroom theatrics, peered over her reading glasses. She looked at Emily's shaking hands, then at the chaotic piles of disorganized binders covering the plaintiff's table. "Is that the entirety of your opening statement?" Counselor Judge Davies asked, her tone dry and dangerously flat. "Yes, Your Honor," Emily squeaked, dropping the papers and practically collapsing back into her chair. Calvin patted her on the shoulder, giving her a firm, approving nod. He actually thought she had done a good job. Judge Davies turned her attention to my table. "The defense may proceed." "Marcus," my lead attorney stood up. He did not rush. He did not carry a mountain of disorganized paper. He simply buttoned his suit jacket, picked up a sleek digital tablet, and walked calmly toward the center of the courtroom. He did not even break a sweat. He possessed the terrifying, predatory calm of a man who knew the battle was over before he even opened his mouth. "Your Honor," Marcus said, his voice rich, steady, and commanding. "The defense does not dispute that the plaintiff has submitted a vast quantity of documents to this court. However, we do aggressively dispute their authenticity. In fact, we find it deeply insulting that the plaintiff would attempt to leverage the federal justice system using amateur fabricated evidence." Emily jumped to her feet. "Objection, counsel is testifying and casting baseless aspersions." "Overruled," Judge Davies snapped, not even looking at Emily. "Sit down, counselor. Proceed, Marcus." With a simple tap on his tablet, Marcus activated the large display screens mounted on the courtroom walls. A high-resolution image of Emily's submitted financial ledger appeared on the monitors. The documents submitted by Ms. Washington, acting as counsel for Calvin Washington, claimed to be historical banking records from 10 years ago. Marcus explained, pacing slowly before the judge's bench. "But digital forensics tell a very different story." Marcus tapped his screen again. A bright red box highlighted the metadata properties of the PDF file. As the court can clearly see from the embedded IP logs and time-stamped digital forensics, these so-called historical ledgers were not created 10 years ago. They were created exactly 4 days ago at 2:14 in the morning, originating from an IP address registered to Calvin Washington's primary residence. Furthermore, our forensic team identified traces of basic photo editing software used to superimpose bank authorization seals over altered numerical columns. Emily let out a sharp, breathless gasp. The color instantly drained from her face, leaving her skin an ashen gray. Calvin's confident posture shattered. He jerked forward in his chair, staring at the screens in absolute disbelief. His flawless, respectable lie was being mathematically dismantled in high definition. But the defense is not here simply to prove forgery. Marcus continued, his voice dropping into a register of absolute chilling authority. He turned his back on Calvin and looked directly up at Judge Davies. Because in the plaintiff's desperate, panicked rush to fabricate these ledgers, they made a catastrophic error in their electronic discovery submission. When extracting data from Washington Freight's internal servers to doctor the numbers, the plaintiff accidentally exported the unredacted master files. Marcus tapped the tablet one final time. The screen shifted, displaying a sprawling, complex flowchart connecting Washington Freight to dozens of unfamiliar corporate entities. Your Honor, we did not just find proof of forgery. Marcus announced, the weight of his words slamming into the quiet courtroom. We found a 20-year trail of massive federal tax fraud. Yvonne let out a loud, horrified wail from the gallery. Jamal buried his face in his hands, his shoulders beginning to shake. Calvin Washington did not just keep one set of books, Marcus explained, detailing the flow of the stolen capital. He kept two. The shadow ledgers, which the plaintiff conveniently handed over to us in their own discovery dump, reveal a systematic scheme of ghost payrolls, inflated vendor invoices, and millions of dollars funneled into offshore shell companies in the Cayman Islands. Calvin Washington's entire lifestyle, his luxury vehicles, his country club memberships, and his waterfront estate were entirely funded by defrauding the Internal Revenue Service for 2 decades. Vanguard Acquisitions did not steal from Washington Freight. Washington Freight was stealing from the federal government. Calvin scrambled to his feet, his chair crashing backward onto the floor. His face was a mask of pure, unhinged terror. That is a lie, Calvin screamed, his voice breaking violently as he pointed a shaking finger at Marcus. Those are not my files. She hacked my servers. She planted that information to destroy me. I am a pillar of the community. I demand you strike that from the record. Silence in my courtroom. Judge Davies roared, slamming her wooden gavel down with explosive force. Mr. Washington, if you open your mouth one more time, I will hold you in criminal contempt and have you thrown in a holding cell. Sit down immediately. Calvin froze, his chest heaving as he stared at the furious federal judge. He slowly sank back into his chair, his hands trembling violently. The illusion of his power was gone. He was nothing but a cornered, exposed fraud. Judge Davies turned her furious gaze upon Emily, who was now hyperventilating, clutching the edge of the table to keep herself from collapsing. Counselor Judge Davies said, her voice dripping with absolute disgust, presenting forged documents to a federal court is not just a breach of ethical conduct. It is a severe criminal offense. I am immediately referring your actions to the State Bar Association for disciplinary review. You can expect to face disbarment proceedings before the end of the month. Emily let out a shattered, sobbing gasp. She buried her face in her arms against the table, crying hysterically as the final nail was driven into the coffin of her career. As for this lawsuit, Judge Davies continued, her eyes sweeping over the devastated plaintiff's table. Based on the irrefutable digital forensics provided by the defense, I am dismissing this case with prejudice. You are barred from ever bringing these fabricated claims before a court of law again. The judge then looked past Calvin, her gaze focusing on the heavy brass doors at the back of the courtroom. Furthermore, Judge Davies announced, her voice echoing with finality. I am remitting all digital evidence submitted today directly to the federal authorities who have been waiting patiently in my gallery. The court recognizes the special agents from the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division. Calvin whipped his head around. 4 men and 2 women wearing dark suits and federal badges stepped out from the back row of the gallery. They did not rush. They walked down the center aisle with the terrifying, inevitable momentum of a collapsing avalanche. No, Calvin whispered, his eyes wide and unblinking. No, you cannot do this. I know the mayor. I know the governor. You cannot do this to me. The lead federal agent stepped through the swinging wooden gate, walking directly up to Calvin's chair. "Calvin Washington," the agent said, his voice entirely devoid of sympathy. "You are under arrest for federal tax evasion, wire fraud, and conspiracy to defraud the United States government. Stand up and place your hands behind your back." Calvin looked desperately toward his family. Yvonne was pressed back against the wooden pew, shaking her head in complete paralyzed horror. The respectability she had clung to her entire life, the country club status she had prized above her own daughter, was instantly annihilated. She would be splashed across the front pages of the Atlanta papers as the wife of a disgraced federal convict. She had absolutely nothing left. Jamal was openly sobbing in the back row. He was crying for the trust fund that would be seized by the government. He was crying for the luxury lifestyle that was permanently gone. He was crying because he finally realized he had no skills, no power, and no future without the stolen money his father had provided. The federal agents grabbed Calvin by the arms, hauling him forcefully to his feet. He offered no physical resistance. The fight had completely drained out of him. The metallic heavy click of the handcuffs echoing through the silent courtroom was the final defining sound of the Washington dynasty's collapse. They marched him down the aisle, a broken, humiliated man, his legacy destroyed by his own uncontrollable arrogance. I did not gloat. I did not smile. I simply closed my briefcase, snapped the golden latches shut, and stood up. I thanked my legal team, buttoned my blazer, and walked smoothly down the center aisle, leaving the wreckage of my family completely behind me. I pushed through the heavy brass doors and stepped out into the grand marble lobby of the federal building. The moment the doors sealed shut behind me, the suffocating, toxic weight of the past 30 years vanished. I took a deep, slow breath. The crisp, clean winter air rushing through the open lobby doors felt like absolute freedom. "Mommy." I turned toward the sound of the bright, joyful voice. Zuri was running across the polished marble floor, her little shoes squeaking, echoing happily in the vast space. My head of security walked a few paces behind her, a gentle smile on his face. I dropped to one knee and scooped my daughter up into my arms, holding her tightly against my chest. She smelled like vanilla and fresh air. She wrapped her small arms around my neck, resting her head against my shoulder. "Look what I made you while you were working," Zuri said, pulling back to proudly display a piece of drawing paper. It was a beautiful, chaotic explosion of crayon colors. In the center of the page were two stick figures holding hands, standing next to a house with a smiling sun shining above them. It was simple. It was perfect. It was a picture of a family built on genuine love, not respectability, not wealth, and not control. "It is beautiful, baby," I said, kissing her softly on the forehead. "I love it so much. Are you ready to go home?" "Yes, please," Zuri beamed. I stood up, holding my daughter on my hip, and walked out through the glass doors of the federal building. The winter sun was bright and blinding against the Atlanta skyline. My security detail opened the heavy armored door of my waiting Maybach. I slid into the luxurious leather back seat, settling Zuri comfortably beside me. The driver smoothly pulled away from the curb, merging into the flowing city traffic. I looked out the tinted window, watching the courthouse disappear into the distance. The war was over. I had protected my empire, I had secured my daughter's future, and I was finally completely at peace. The ultimate lesson from Aisha's journey is that true power and self-worth are never granted by toxic family members. They are built through unwavering independence and resilience. When surrounded by manipulation and conditional love, the greatest revenge is not just exposing their lies, but outgrowing their need for control entirely. Narcissists will always project their own insecurities onto you, but their carefully constructed glass houses will inevitably shatter against the weight of the truth. You do not owe your loyalty to those who only value you when you shrink yourself. Stand tall, build your own empire, and never apologize for protecting your peace. Have you ever had to walk away from a toxic environment to protect your own peace? And how did you find the strength to build your own empire? Share your story in the comments below.